Hello, my name is Joseph. Um, this is for monetary economics, and my research question here is: did Ecuador gain more from monetary credibility than it lost from monetary independence? So this presentation is going to be asking, or is asking, whether Ecuador gained more from monetary credibility than it lost uh, from its monetary independence. So Ecuador experienced severe banking and currency crisis in the late 1990s, 2000, attributed to the oil prices going down at certain points, um, lack of credibility due to inflation, and I think at some point I read the government not letting people take their savings out. So in the 2000s, it abandoned its sucre, its currency, and adopted the US dollar. Some of the key trade-offs of this was that dollarization, well, we believe it can restore trust, reduce inflation, increase stability, but it also means giving up domestic monetary policy tools like interest rates and potentially exchange rates adjustments. So was it worthwhile or not? That's what we're looking for. So here we can see this chart, and it gives us the level of inflation. This is from, as you can see, United States, Ecuador inflation differential. Actually, here's just Ecuador's inflation. And this is from the paper of, if I remember correctly, Bolaños in 2023 published. This is where we get our data from, our empirical data. Yes, so before dollarization, on the left hand side, before the 2000s, we can see sort of quite a bit of volatility. We see sort of potentially the banking crisis. South America has been known to have a disconnect between sort of banks and the average person. So we see that weakened confidence in the financial institutions. We see fiscal dominance, the effect of fiscal dominance when we see sort of the government sort of governing parts of the central bank, and as a result, sort of potential lack of stability. So we see sort of households preferring the US dollar to the sucre as a form of saving, so hence sort of purchasing the US dollar, less demand for sucre, more demand for US dollar, and as a derived demand, we see sort of the devaluation of the sucre and strengthening of the US dollar. So one thing that we can see here from the graph, though, is that inflation suddenly surges around the time of the crisis. And this is not just a rise in prices, but is a broader collapse of Ecuador's monetary regime. So the spike that we see here, you can see with the arrow pointed at it. So it's a sharp spike immediately before dollarization. So this just represents a broader loss of confidence in Ecuador's monetary institutions. Or it could also be sort of the expected transition to the US dollar. So next we have, so what is Ecuador benefiting from adopting the US dollar? So they're importing credibility. So before dollarization, we see that sort of Ecuador has had its independent monetary policy. It could devalue currency, it could print money, but they had very low credibility. So promises of low inflation were just not believed due to sort of past performance. By adopting the US dollar, Ecuador effectively tied its own hands, although it sort of imported credibility from the US, from the sort of monetary policy of the US, the Fed. We see that they do lose so their ability to control their monetary policy. So before dollarization, policymakers could always promise low inflation, but households were sort of not likely to believe this. whereas by having the US dollar, Ecuador effectively had sort of no real decision in the matter in terms of, is there going to be inflation or well, I guess it's more in the lines of you could no longer create money to devalue its currency. So this is more the loss of control. So it lost its discretion to increase the credibility of monetary policy. So here we see, so did it actually work? So we see here the yellow bar shows the Ecuador's inflation rate, and so the turquoise one is the US. So we see here there's evidence that suggests, and this is from Bolaño's paper, the evidence that before dollarization, high inflation, like this bar, this sort of line sort of jumping up all the way up to almost 10, something around 1994. And so this, it just shows that there was large levels of inflation, a high differential between the US and Ecuador. Now, after dollarization, we can see sort of this adjustment period, and then eventually it narrows, restoring, I suppose, credibility in the fact that now they are keeping inflation low. But I mean, the question bears, is it that they're importing potential inflation if the US is to have inflation? But nonetheless, they're sort of foregoing their choice to their options to sort of print money, or have their own legal tender. So evidence suggests from here that dollarization, the main objective, was successful, lowering the volatility of inflation and lowering inflation itself due to credibility. So what did what they give up? So before dollarization, they had control of interest rates, exchange rates, monetary policy, and sort of with that we see sort of more control in terms of sort of fiscal borrowing, government spending, current capital spending. They could just print more money if they so needed, or they could sort of have that fiscal dominance in terms of giving sort of prodding the central bank to print money, and maybe foregoing the target of inflation or inflation management to accommodate sort of fiscal demands. So yeah, they forgo that. So after dollarization, we see sort of a higher credibility, price stability, but also exposed to US monetary policy. And from the impulse response here from the paper of Bolaños, we can see that when the Fed rises interest rates, Ecuador GDP falls. I suppose it's the impact of the cost of borrowing, the reward for saving. If it's going up, we potentially see that things become a bit more expensive. That potentially has an effect on Ecuador, lowering their GDP, the value of the overall output of goods and services. Yes, so the cost of dollarization was a loss of independence, or independence in terms of the adjusting mechanism. So if, for example, Ecuador enters a recession, they can no longer simply just lower interest rates to stimulate the economy or devalue its currency to support demand, especially demand for something inelastic that they export, which is very important. That hasn't been mentioned before. It's oil. So this dollarization therefore imposed monetary discipline in terms of fiscal spending, because they could no longer just print money. So finally, was this worth it? Was dollarization worth it? So we see some of the benefits outweigh the costs. According to sort of the empirical data, we see that yes, it was, in terms of achieving low inflation, credibility, in terms of the expectations, and this is sort of based on Beckerman's theoretical discussion and empirical evidence from Bonilla Bolaños. Ecuador appears to have gained more from the credibility than from what it lost in terms of independence. So yes, they cannot adjust their currency anymore. It was more of a credibility reform. So evidence suggests that despite the loss of policy flexibility, the improvement in inflation performance was a good trade-off. In terms of what I sort of looked a bit more into was one of the key things is Ecuador's sort of major export is oil. So it's quite interesting to see sort of that, if a country is struggling when they have something that is sort of very important worldwide, why is the outcome not the same as Norway, for example, right? Why is the outcome going sort of the other way? It's close to Venezuela, where sort of exporters of something that is quite important, but yet not economically not doing well. So normally, we see that fiscal borrowing, constant fiscal borrowing, we're looking at government spending, sort of it's from taxes, from borrowing, from selling debt, and since they no longer have this, we see that, well, since they no longer have their own currency, this has to come from the US dollar, so they're taxing, I guess, oil. They're potentially borrowing from international markets, they're borrowing US dollars and repaying those back in US dollars. It's no longer that they can print their own currency to make repayments. So the idea was, or the thoughts were, that this might cause austerity just after the introduction of the US dollar as the main form of currency. But actually, no, it wasn't. They didn't go into austerity, and I think one of the benefits or reasons for this, and that it worked for Ecuador, is the fact that their major export is oil. If we were looking at sort of Bangladesh or other countries where their export is something elastic, then we will see sort of the Marshall-Lerner condition taking place, where sort of a weak currency can encourage sort of more revenue into the country. Whereas in the case of Ecuador, actually a stronger currency is better for them because they're exporting something that is valuable. So overall revenue will increase, especially sort of the US dollar going into their country. And so if it sounds like a worthwhile decision being made by Ecuador that potentially Venezuela could also do to recover their economy at a very fast pace, but it wouldn't work for other countries that sort of export elastic products, because then for them actually it's better to have a weak currency. Yes, so the revenue from taxes from oil helped prevent austerity and increase spending through the presidency of Rafael Carrera. Great. Thank you very much for listening.